Welcome to OrgUp Presents, where we talk with strategists and organizers who have penetrated frameworks to offer our movements for peace, justice, and radical change. I'm Max Elbaum. I'm an editor of Organizing Upgrade. And if you're listening on Facebook, give us a like. If you're listening on YouTube, please give us a like and subscribe. Tonight, we're excited to host Rashad Robinson, president of Color of Change. Founded after Katrina in 2005, Color of Change now has 7 million members. It's the largest online organization advocating specifically for racial justice, a better life for Black people, and justice for all. They've been powering campaigns for years, especially in the last period, campaigns against police violence and murder of Black people. Tonight, Rashad's going to offer us his perspective on racial justice, not just as a moral imperative and as the timely struggle of the moment, but as a winning strategy to move forward the struggles for social progress, equality, democracy, and social change. After Rashad's presentation, three organizers and activists, strategists are going to engage his ideas, ask him some questions, offer some opinions of their own. We have Purvi Shah, executive director of the Movement Law Lab and co-founder of Lawyers for Black Lives, Gianni Webster, national field organizer for Right to the City and also one of the hosts of Organizing Upgrade's Frontline Dispatch series, and Isaac Ontiveros, a labor educator now working in the health sector. So we're really excited about tonight's program. Sit back and enjoy and learn something from Rashad's presentation. Welcome, Rashad. Take it away.
Thank you, Max. Thank you to Organizing Upgrade, the whole community. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Looking forward to the discussion after. I'm going to share a slide deck that really sort of roots in sort of some of the thoughts at Color of Change, but some of the thoughts we're sharing across the movement about how to think about this moment and how do we translate what's happened in the election to the work ahead to win, with a deep recognition that elections don't give us the sort of sum total of what we need. They are a piece of a strategy. And my hope is to sort of share some of the thinking really rooted in what we're doing at Color of Change, but also how we recognize, like all organizations, we need to operate inside of an ecosystem and be in collaboration with so many other groups that are working across race and class and gender and so much more in geography. For those of you, Max just said a little bit about Color of Change, but for those of you who are new to us, we were founded in the aftermath of a flood, which was Hurricane Katrina. It was caused by bad decision makers, and it turned into a life-altering disaster by bad decision makers. Black folks were literally on their roofs begging for the government to do something and left to die. And, you know, Katrina illustrated a lot of things that people already knew: geographic segregation, generational poverty, the impacts of what we've done to our planet, and so many other systems. But at the heart of Katrina, no one was nervous about disappointing Black people: government, corporations, and media. And when institutions are not nervous about disappointing your community, it doesn't matter what kind of research report that you have that illustrates all the facts and figures. It doesn't matter sometimes what you do in the courts if you don't have the power to actually implement it. And so much of the work at Color of Change is translating what we talk about as presence, visibility, awareness, into the power to actually change the rules. From presence to power. And in so many ways, that really animates how I am going to sort of present these next set of slides. So can we bring them up, and I'll take us away. All right. And now we're full screen. And so in this framework of no one being nervous about disappointing Black people, government, corporations, and media, I also want to center the transformational power of Black political participation, of Black engagement, right? Far too often, Black communities and Black people are talked about from a deficit perspective. But I want to really center my presentation on the role and the power of Black communities and the role and the power of racial justice. And so, you know, racial justice powers participation. And I want to start off, there's a lot of talk about what happened in this last election, but I want to root us in a story that racial justice won. I want to root us in the fact and the sort of concept that we won this election, that racial justice won the election. That doesn't mean that all of our problems are solved. What it means is that racial justice powered participation. When the voter registration numbers flattened out this summer, it was the uprisings over police violence that revived them. When we thought in some ways that the best, in the midst of the pandemic, when so many people thought the best activism that was going to happen was uplifting investigative journalism and clapping outside of our windows, it was racial justice that powered people into the streets, powered people to engagements, powered people to stand up in new and powerful ways. And so racial justice is not just the outcome of fighting racism. It's not just about fighting racism. It is a powerful, and I would say the most powerful tool that we have on the left to sort of move us from presence to power. Whenever an issue is stuck, I believe that there's a racial justice component that can move it. Racial justice is also persuasion. Just think about where we were at 10 years ago in terms of the conversations about race, the conversations about so many issues. 7, 8 years ago, saying Black Lives Matter, people would say you're a racist. Now it's on streets, and now it's hanging up in all sorts of halls of power. This is really important that we sort of once again are clear about the difference between presence and power, but that we recognize the ways in which we are persuading folks. We are moving more and more folks onto our side. We've changed how voters think and feel about the world and their role in it. That has been the power, the sort of political participation power and the narrative power of our movements, of the work to drive a new level of change. Racial justice delivered big wins, across the country. It wasn't just, I'm not simply, when I say racial justice won, I'm not just talking about what happened at the top of the ticket. Progressive prosecutors, new progressive leaders, Senate seats, ballot initiatives across the board. We watch as racial justice powered engagements in places like the LA district attorney races, in ballot measures around drugs, and in Senate races like we just saw in Georgia. New progressive leaders like Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush and others showing up in Congress and already moving on issues directly related to policing and so much more, bringing those issues to the table in ways that they were not brought before. But racial justice can be a majoritarian idea. We can actually have the majority, but it doesn't mean that we have a governing majority. I am not being Pollyanna about where we are at. I want to just claim where we are at and then also talk very clearly about where we need to go. How do we translate the majoritarian idea into a governing majority? Because only if we build the power, the infrastructure to turn this into a governing majority, do we actually build the leverage to force and move government to do the things that we needed to do, to build the leverage to hold corporations accountable and challenge them on all of the ways in which they've enabled the past and will enable and stall progress in the future. Racial justice is a winning strategy, but we are not here to simply dream about how a stronger democracy would produce racial justice. We are here to act on the insights that racial justice is the most effective tool we have to producing a stronger democracy. Said another way, we do not get racial justice out of a true democracy. A true democracy gives us racial justice because the rules and the norms that are baked into the structures which prevent us from being able to have a voice, for being able to move on issues like climate and healthcare and policing and so much more, is racial injustice. And so far too often folks center racial justice simply because it's the moral thing to do. Or maybe folks are centering it because they don't want to get in trouble with those Black and brown activists. I would say all of that is fine. But what if we both recognized its moral power? What if folks were very clear that they're going to be held accountable by movements? But what if all of that was true and we also just centered the fact that racial justice is a strategic driver? And by choosing racial justice, we're not simply doing something charitable for other communities or even our own. We are actually just centering the force multiplier that allows us to win in really powerful ways. From presence to power at Color of Change, all of this means that we are then moving this work around racial justice into sort of what does it mean to power real wins around progressive prosecutors all around the country, movements, local and national, driven by activists all around the country that has centered racial justice. The work to hold Silicon Valley has been centering racial justice as the winning strategy, both to unlock the people power of holding these institutions accountable, but also to force real policy change, to build boycotts, to force those leaders to the table. The work in Hollywood to engage a new dialogue around the representations of our lives with a deep understanding that the stories that get told that move all around the country and dare I say all around the world have a deep impact on what we can achieve. The narrative power that oftentimes holds us back from winning, this transition that we are in the middle of, and the role that racial justice needs to play, the ongoing role of voter activism, and of course, COVID recovery, right? It's not just enough for us to think about the disparities and how do we fix those. It is about centering racial justice as the vehicle to actually power the type of change, the type of legislation, the type of practice change that makes us recover. If racial justice was at the center of the recovery legislation before, we wouldn't have been in a place on the back end of trying to fix all the ways that Black and brown small businesses did not actually get relief, all of the ways in which we are dealing with deep impacts of inequity of how that legislation was moved. And so what does this mean? It means long-term change is going to require long-term investments. And I don't really have to say this to you all as activists and organizers. Sometimes folks think our work operates on an election cycle, but it doesn't. Our work operates across election cycles, and sometimes they are sort of indicators of where we are heading, and sometimes they're not. But I do think there's a set of things that we have to realize as a strategy. Infrastructure needs that to build, investment needs as a movement that are 21st century and are going to be incredibly important to us, not just winning and building power, but holding on to that power. As I think about media, it's not just about getting our stories out, but it's about getting our stories in. The difference between getting our stories out and getting our stories in is how people sort of operationalize them, how people think about it, the decisions that people make. It's not folks just saying the right thing, but it's folks doing the right thing. It's building powerful brands across our movement that give people a sense of connection, that allow us to translate their aspirations and their energy, motivate people to action because they feel connected with our movement, feel connected with what we're delivering. The ongoing deep engagement, proactive engagement in communities, both urban and rural and suburban, that's going to be required, authentic connection and infrastructure. And when I talk about infrastructure, I am just as much talking about people, or maybe more talking about people, than I'm talking about tools. Talking about mobilization and the ability, and of course, the work, the interconnected work of accountability, drawing those bright lines and then being able to push back when necessary to force the type of accountability necessary to move us forward. The power to define what is needed is the power to shape what is delivered. And in so many ways, when our communities can define what is needed, we can then shape what we actually get. And that in so many ways is what we do from an organizing perspective, right? Build power for people so that though folks in their communities can define what they deserve, what they need, and then we can then build the infrastructure, the accountability, the media work, the organizing work to go out and ensure that it happens. And so in order to get there, I believe that we need a couple of different types of leadership over these next 4 years. So after the 2016 election, I spent some time really thinking about the different types of roles and different types of leadership that we needed in a resistance. And kind of like what really would be the difference between a resistance and an opposition. We talked about 4 years ago, mediators, fighters, and winners. And mediators being folks in some ways that feel they can work with folks that don't share our values on the other side, that they can sort of figure out how to engage. I have become less and less comfortable with the idea of any percentage of mediators. This is not to say that we don't have to find ways to compromise. This is not to say that we don't have to find ways to win in ways that we may not get everything that we want. But I don't want us to be confused or about who Mitch McConnell is. I don't want us to be confused about who the Republicans are who would not certify the election, who they are, and to think that we are going to sort of negotiate in good faith with folks that have not been willing, who stole the Supreme Court seat. This, once again, is not saying that we're not going to work with folks and move things forward. It is saying that we recognize what that actually looks like. Then we need fighters. And, you know, back in the resistance era, the fighters were, in my space, the kind of folks that weren't negotiating with Trump. They were holding enablers accountable. They were pointing and pivoting at corporations and media, working to hold the line between real solutions and fake solutions, holding the line between corporate engagement and corporate enablerism, holding the line between what's a good use of our time and what is a bad use of our time, like a petition calling on Mitch McConnell to stand up for affirmative action, which we know is a bad use of time. Then there are winners. And winners, you know, show us what's possible. Winners, I'm not talking about winning an argument here. I'm talking about winning real world change that makes people's lives better. After 2016, I was really talking about winning at the local level, but make no mistake, 2022 will be defined in so many ways by what we can win now. What real world change is delivered for people and the type of leadership. And then we need builders. And when I think about builders, I think about the road ahead. I think about the ongoing work to build things that we may not be able to win on an election cycle, that we may not be able to transform overnight. But if we're not building the infrastructure and the long-term change, it's the narrative and cultural strategies that need to be built. It's the work to shift, our incentive structures around things like monopolies and building more power around breaking up businesses that have become too big. It is the building work around a healthcare system that actually delivers for all of us. At Color of Change, we've worked over the years around progressive prosecutors, around our work in Hollywood, our work in Silicon Valley, building long-term. Each of these areas are gonna be critical, and thinking about sort of where we fit in these areas. I don't believe that you can call yourself a mediator and a fighter at the same time. And there are ways in which some of these others actually do overlap. But really being clear, and then us as a movement, being able to hold one another to the ways in which we're showing up and delivering on real success. I think that we need 3 types of power to make this moment matter. We need the power to deliver big change, the power to protect our people and help our people who need it. So much about what's going to have to come next around COVID relief, around standing up to white nationalists, is about our ability to protect our people, not just fighting policy fights or communications fights, but actually making sure we get things in the hands of people who need them and who have been suffering. And then the power to weaken the forces that stand in our way, whether they be corporations, police unions, or any of the infrastructure that stands in the way of real change. If we are not working to simultaneously weaken those forces while winning big change, we're not fighting to build the terrain that's going to be winnable long term. We need to focus on this infrastructure for a number of reasons. First, President-elect Biden is not a celebrity like the last two presidents. We're gonna have to build our own cultural movements. We're gonna have to expand conversations outside of the Beltway. So many of the ways in which, the energy that we're going to need is not gonna come from the White House. I have joked that, I know a lot of folks that don't like the deep heat and the deep cold. And they stood on the deep heat and the deep cold to watch President Obama. We probably will not see that in this era. And so just in terms about what does it mean for a base beyond sort of maybe our email list, a base beyond our staffs, beyond our sort of close-knit structures, making sure that we are recognizing that if we're not building a cultural movement outside of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, then we're not setting ourselves up to have the power to face down all of the attacks we're going to see. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think is sort of the elements of a new strategy for a new decade. First of all, it's going to be leveraging racial justice as a winning strategy for driving progress across the economy, healthcare, voting, big tech, criminal justice, and so much more. Investing in getting our agenda out. Billions of dollars was spent in this last election and no policy actually passed. Part of this will be pushing philanthropy, pushing our movement to recognize that we have to infuse our movements with just as much resources to actually win real world change as we did to actually get people elected. Our jobs are not giving politicians jobs, but about winning real world change. Talking in truths and not just in talking points. And this means building the narrative infrastructure that actually is required to reach people. Far too often, we get beat by our opponents just in terms of their ability to reach people. Building our infrastructure, both online and offline, the channels, being able to arm influencers and celebrities in ways that actually allow us to deal with the fact that we don't have a 24-hour news station on our side. We don't have a network of radio stations. Defeating corporate enablers means not just calling corporations out, but building and gaining leverage over those corporations so we can force them to do the things that we need them to do. Refusing to give anything away too soon, to give too much praise away, to negotiate away our leverage. Our leverage, our approval is one of the things that sort of is our most powerful tool, and we need to hold on to it. We need to, of course, dismantle the tools of disinformation. We need to recognize that the Trump brand is going to be around and it's going to change in many different ways, but that is going to be sort of an animating feature. And with that said, President Obama was a change candidate. Even George W. Bush, to a certain extent, was a change candidate, even though, we can all contend that, Bush and Cheney, we should not give them any flowers. They worked to make people poor and criminalize poverty. They worked to force people to migrate, and then they criminalize migration. But change candidates oftentimes work inside the system. Trump was a change the rules candidate. Changing the rules is a different archetype. We may have disagreed with the politics of a previous urban housing and urban development secretary or a previous education secretary, but we knew they knew something about housing and urban development or education. Changing the rules is a completely different archetype. Biden ran as a restoration candidate. He put together a fragile coalition on that promise. And in so many ways, there are no good old days for Black and brown communities. There's only the road ahead. And so as much as there may be a restoration administration coming in, we need to do the work to recognize that restoration will not be enough for our communities. Restoration will not be enough in 2022. And restoration will not be a metric by which we judge the success and the wins that will power us forward. Biden will not be a celebrity president, and that's going to be incredibly important for us to remember. We've got to understand the opposition in so many ways. In the battle between Biden and Trump, racial justice delivered. In so many ways, we now know what racial justice can do for an election. The question ahead is, what will this election do for racial justice? That means that as we think about the right-wing takedown machine, racial justice will be one of our most powerful forces, our most connected forces, to actually hold people on our side, to channel people to push back, to build the energy to hold folks accountable. When we think about the accountability of corporate enablers that's happening right now, it's racial justice that's powering so much of that effort. Racial justice that's driving corporations to have to make a choice, that's animating the energy of employees inside of companies to speak out and push back, and so much more. You know, there's several keys that I think to winning long-term change, but some things that we have to remember. We are going to be facing the largest grassroots right-wing resistance in decades, and we must use every moment to effectively define and brand the Trump-powered right wing. We're not always used to having that type of powerful right-wing engagement facing us down. Oftentimes, you know, we've seen a lot of obstruction during the Obama years. We've seen all sorts of attacks. But this in the streets activism will be something different. And we're going to have to do the work to both define them, to hold those that sort of want to play both sides in the media landscape, the work to actually tell the story about what's happening in ways that are accurate. The right-wing mainstreams extremism more and more every day, and we must weaken it. Make any associations with the right-wing toxic. Make the right wing perceived as corrupt and self-serving. Make whatever the right wing demands laughable and repulsive, because it is, because these demands are laughable after what we've dealt with after the last 4 years. We have to make racial justice incompatible with the right wing persona, because so many more Americans want to be on the side of racial justice. And the right wing persona stands in direct opposition to that. We have to cast the right wing as dangerous, but without making them more powerful. Folks who are sitting inside of their basements reading conspiracy theories all day are not powerful, but they have they've been able to gain power because folks have enabled them, because institutions have profited off of them, because there have been those that have seen holding on to powers connecting to them. And so we have to connect those dots and make sure that we are constantly pointing and pivoting, making sure that we are sort of defining these things very clearly so that we're not giving too much credit, giving too much power to forces you know, that we shouldn't be giving them to, but instead holding the enabler forces accountable for their inability to actually be on the right side of justice, for the profiteering that they've done as a result. You know, this is how the right wing works. There's a strategy of suppression. We watched this past election season as we worked, as we moved from voter suppression to ballot suppression. And they're going to use these levers of power against us in all sorts of ways. But organizing and power building is our clearest path to victory, our clearest path to channeling presence to power, building narrative power and people power. And those two things go hand in hand, because you can't have narrative power without people in motion, because people build the narratives that power our ability to define the issue, to define what is needed. Because the power to define what is needed is the power to shape what is delivered. And in so many ways, sort of as we sort of face tomorrow, and I'm just going to close down the slide and talk to you all for a second. You know, I've been thinking a lot about how we talk about these issues. Sort of what does it mean in this moment to tell a story that is not just from a deficit perspective about where we're at. And I want to invite everyone into a story, particularly as we come out of Georgia and as we move ahead. The stories that we tell ourselves about what happened, the stories that we tell ourselves about where we're going, what if that story centered ourselves on Black people being the protagonists in the American story of voting? No group of people have fought harder, stood on longer lines, faced more indignity in order to express our will for a better future. And what is a protagonist if it isn't the folks in the story that you root for, the folks in the story that are facing obstacles, the folks in the story that are coming up against barriers? So as we continue to tell ourselves stories, let's not talk about communities as vulnerable when they've actually been targeted, under attack, exploited. Let's center a story not simply on how do we help communities, but how do we remove the barriers, because we're not looking for charitable solutions to structural problems. We are working to build real change because you fight for the protagonist. And that, my friends, is how we build the infrastructure to both understand what is needed and to deliver it for the people that need it. Because then and only then do we actually make good on all the work that we're doing and make good on the sort of ask we have for people to follow us. Thank you all, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Rashad. You know, the great thing about having a central thread or framework is it gives you a chance to hook all your organizing together and put the different pieces of the ecosystem that Rashad referred to into perspective and operate in harmony. Racial justice as a winning strategy, as a force multiplier, as a driver, it's a very powerful thread. I saw it happen in the 60s, the period that produced my generation of radicals and revolutionaries. And the uprising has shown its power again today. It has to be fleshed out and deepened, and each component of it gets developed further. And we hope to see some of that discussion of how we dive in and flesh it out and make it real in all of its aspects in this conversation. So that's why we've asked 3 people from different sectors of the social movements to engage with this perspective and have a conversation with Rashad about where we're headed from here. So just to reintroduce Purvi Shah, the Executive Director of the Movement Law Lab, co-founder of Law for Black Lives; Gianni Webster, National Field Organizer for Right to the City and also a host of Organizing Upgrade's Frontline Dispatch; and labor educator in the health sector, Isaac Ontiveros. So we're going to start with Gianni and have a conversation for the next half hour or so about how to take this framework and turn it into the kind of wins that it has the potential to do.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Max, for the introduction. Rashad, deeply appreciate the analysis that you put out and your presentation. I want to kind of deepen the conversation around some of the links you were making between racial justice and democracy. And I agree 100% that the fight for racial justice makes democracy possible. But I'm also still sitting with the fact that we have to also contend with the fact that democracy is limited and undermined by capitalism. And so I think if we were to treat racial justice as a strategy, as you say, and not just like as this moral imperative, then centering racial capitalism in the discussion of democracy is going to be incredibly important. I think back to just my organizing work, whether it was with fast food workers or supporting tenants facing eviction. And it was kind of in those fights for, say, better wages or tenant protections. You know, we were facing capitalism and its drive to extract wealth from Black and brown labor. And we were facing capitalism's drive to privatize the land and property that limited the ability of the state to actually protect and expand democracy in those situations. So for those workers and for those tenants. And so I would say that capitalism is at extreme odds with democracy. And we have to combine that fight for racial justice with that of fighting capitalism. And so I have a curiosity just listening to your presentation, and also Monday night, I had the pleasure of hearing a bit more from you. I just kind of want to get your thoughts on where does anti-capitalist struggle fit into the framework on racial justice and democracy? In particular, you spoke about corporate enablers. And I think that corporations play more of an antithetical role to democracy than just being enablers. I think they oftentimes can erode democracy.
So yeah, I mean, first of all, I agree with everything that you just said. I think that the ways in which capitalism in so many ways has superseded democracy is just one more reason why racial justice, right, has to be centered. And just the sort of foundations of a country rooted in the sort of stealing and genocide of indigenous people and the servitude of Black labor, an economy that was built off of that. And then over the years, at every turn, the exploitation, right, of labor that has had race sort of as its center. And even when there were movements to win economic change, we watched as sort of racial justice not having the right level of power in those movements. We saw, you know, whether it's the New Deal and other sort of movements, we saw, you know, the ways in which capitalism and racial injustice colluded to create, you know, a deeply hostile climate. You know, our campaign work absolutely centers corporate accountability, and you know, oftentimes we use the framework of enablers. It's a more public sort of narrative and framework for our campaigns about how we're pushing corporations to actually stop doing what they're doing, how I'm trying to mobilize employees who work inside of companies. There's a difference in what I can do at a company that has organized labor versus a company that doesn't have organized labor, and the type of education that's been done and movement building. But I would just say that there is no path to victory without us dealing with capitalism, without us dealing with all of the ways in which it has superseded democracy. And I think in some ways, Donald Trump is a perfect example of that. And this is not to say that Donald Trump is the only electoral example, right? I remember in 2016, February 2016, Black History Month, there was what was built as an intersectional gathering of Black leaders meeting in the Eisenhower Room with President Obama. And we were going around the table, and this was like, you know, height of a lot of the policing conversations. And I remember bringing up the conversation of the DNC going back on its rule around corporate lobbyist donations and corporate donations. And it was as if like I brought something that wasn't about race into a room. Like it was like, and President Obama was a deeply thoughtful, smart person. I mean, you know, with all of the pushback and limitations, you do sort of recognize that someone that could run a meeting for 4 hours and know the issues, like while it should be a low bar for a president, you know, we haven't had that for a while. But he instantly responded, you know what you should be doing? You should be working to end Citizens United. And I was like, just that? But what if the Democrats are taking money from like, and then he knew, I think he was struggling with the answer, because I feel like in some ways he may have agreed with aspects of what I was saying, especially given how he ran his earlier campaigns, and some of the earlier bans were related to him. And he said, I won my first campaign, and I won my second campaign for president, and I was outspent. And I guess what I want all of us to recognize as we think about the role of capitalism and the role of racial hierarchy, the role of gender injustice, that just because we win an election doesn't mean we win. And we can win an election and give away our leverage and power. So I appreciate that question. I also appreciate sort of the roots of what does it mean to think about the role of racial justice at hitting at capitalism and so much more.
Thanks, Rashad.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Rashad. This was a really thoughtful and provocative conversation. And I think the thing I'm really holding is this idea of racial justice as not just a defense, but it's the offense, right? And that and racial justice is the portal through which we can achieve so many other things. But I think building off Jayani's point, and I think what is like a very live conversation actually right now about democracy and this idea that, you know, when we look at the origins of the United States, where we look at the way our American democracy has had so much corruption inside of it, right? Whether our role in other parts of the world or whether the way we've withered away democracy through things like gerrymandering or attack on voting rights, that what I find amongst a lot of younger progressives is sometimes like a complete and utter loss of faith that an American democracy could mean something for them. And I think what you're encouraging us to think about is racial justice as a portal, but to also fight, to contend for governing power, to contend for state power. And so I think the question I want to ask you is like, what do we say to those of us who are really clear-eyed and sober about the way the state has failed us, right? When we look at the coronavirus response, or we look at mass incarceration or policing, or the collusion between military, police, and the current, situation in our federal government and the attempted coup, that it's sort of eroded a sense of possibility that we should fight for a state, we should have governing power. And I'm just curious, like, I'm sure you've had that conversation many times, and I'm just curious if you could share more of your thoughts about why we should fight for a state, and what's possible when we have a state that's powered by a multiracial democracy that centers racial justice.
Yeah, that's such a big question and such a hard question. I would be lying if I don't have multiple times of the year where I don't like wake up and, look at myself in the mirror and be like, what are you doing, Rashad? Like, what? Like what's going on? And so I want to be like honest about that, because if we're not honest about that, we're like trying to sell people an aspirational story that is not rooted in the realities of the wins and the losses, right? And oftentimes feeling and experiencing the losses in ways that hurt way more than the joy of some of the wins. There's a short answer and a long answer. I'm going to try to give like the shorter answer here. And my shorter answer is that my good friend and board chair Heather McGhee oftentimes talks about America being a land of ancestral strangers, right? Of people in this who don't have connection to each other in other ways and are now trying an experiment of a multiracial democracy. And I know what's possible when we don't have a multiracial democracy. I know what's possible when we don't contend for power. I know what will happen when we allow a majority of power, corporate power, to govern us in ways where we have no leverage, don't actually force them. I know what that looks like. And I only know what that looks like in my own lifetime. I only have the stories of my grandparents and great-grandparents and those before them. I only have the books and the documentaries to go on of the people that came before us. And so, we are making a bet, right? And to organize and to fight and to mobilize for liberation is about making bets, to believe that something more is possible. But I have to believe it. When I think about what it meant for people who were in chattel slavery to rub the moss on trees and follow a star for a better tomorrow because they believed that something was better for them someplace else, I have to believe that our ability to bring people together to fight for a better tomorrow exists. And I believe that it means that we have to find the really human ways to both work with one another, listen to one another, and deal with one another and challenge with one another. But a multiracial democracy really doesn't exist like this. And so we are making a bet. We are making a bet that something can both be built, invented, and sustained. And the final thing I would just say is that, I had the pleasure of listening to Stacey Abrams the other day. She came and joined us on a staff call to just say hello and appreciation to the Color of Change team. We've partnered with Fair Fight over the years. And as I was just listening to her talk, I was just reminded about how much the systems that we need and we rely on are weak. They rely on people. They rely on folks putting aside sometimes their own personal needs, corruption, so much more for, what's fair and what's just. And that is a really tricky bet for us to make. And so I really appreciate the question. I don't know if I completely answered it, because I want to just say that if I were to just come out with 3 bullet points, it would be dishonest. What my 3 bullet points are is what I know about building power, what I know about challenging and ensuring that those who are decision makers are nervous about disappointing us. What I know is about how to move people in the right direction so we can disrupt the magical thinking that we oftentimes have about what is necessary to make change. But the promised land, right? The land that we get to and want to get to, because I haven't been there, I can only dream about what it looks like.
I can go, Max? Yeah.
Sure.
So thanks, Rashad, for your presentation, and thanks, Max, and organizing Upgrade, and Privy and Johnny, your questions and comments. I'm really appreciating it. I guess I'm thinking 2 things roughly. I guess first I'm thinking about your presentation as a useful framework for workers' organizations as they confront racial discrimination in the workplace, deadly racialized health inequity, and the long legacy of racist anti-union programs, policies, and legislation. I'm interested in how frameworks like this can be forcefully mobilized to both build stronger, sharper labor movements, right, or a labor movement, and have that movement be more durably fused with stronger social movements towards winning a political strategy that advances both racial justice and working class power. And I think as we think of working class power, as kind of alluded to, it compels us to consider the positionality and protagonism of imprisoned, undocumented, and refugee community members when we think about fighters and winners and builders. Advancing from there, in the sector that I work in, we often talk a lot about global solidarity amongst frontline workers facing anti-worker political corporate attacks, and meaning also intense racial and gendered oppression. So I'm excited to think about, this is my question is, how can this framework, what are your thoughts on how this framework could be used to build internationalism at a time when racism is so central to right-wing programs and the right-wing programs of regimes that are so allied with Trumpism, right, and the far-right agenda, thinking about Modi and his BJP movement in India, the anti-indigenous and anti-black politics driving Bolsonaro in Brazil, or the colonial and apartheid project of the Israeli regime in the land of the Palestinian people, with also understanding that those international struggles also take place here amongst the diaspora.
Yeah, wow, that's a big question. And so a couple of things that I would say, a couple of thoughts that I have, and also, the thing that when I began offering up this framework and this, that I knew would be provocative for some, that would force us to actually have to sort of rewire how we think about racial justice, especially racial justice activists sometimes who spent years asking people to come on board, be allies, to our work, or to include us. It is a different way of showing up, and it's a different way of sort of engaging around these issues. Part of this was that I knew that there would be all sorts of jazz that people would play with this inside of the spaces that they were working with. And my hope is for sort of people to sort of take this level of sheet music I have put together and to improvise and do the jazz that sort of, will help me learn, right? That I'm going to learn from. I do think that the work, this summer, I had a lot of multinational corporations reach out to us saying Black Lives Matter. We don't take corporate financial support. So we turned down about $10.5 million of corporate money, which, if you've ever had to fundraise for an organization or be responsible for making sure people get paid, like, that's a real thing, they were definitely like, mornings I woke up was just like, I just hope I can pay everybody because we were just turning down money. But it was interesting, particularly even for a lot of the corporations that were headquartered overseas, the way they would talk about what was happening in the United States, almost divorced from the things that were happening in other parts of the world, was illuminating, but also sort of is the thing that corporations will do if we let them, right? It's what they're designed to do, right? They're incentivized to compartmentalize problems. Facebook is facing all of these challenges here in the United States as if they weren't complicit and deeply responsible for uprisings and murders in other countries around the world. But it's almost like it's like new now, and they're like defending what they're doing as if like this is not like just same script, different cast. And so, I think like part of this is the education work that we've got to do to make sure that we're not in these zero-sum games about what does winning look like, that we recognize that when we're challenging these forces that we hold the line around what winning actually means. And I think it means that even in terms of our multiracial movements here in the United States, right? You're talking about international efforts, but right here in this country, in our own efforts, we can sometimes step on one another to try to be first in line, in a meal line that's actually not serving us any food that any of us actually want. And so part of this is like rewiring a lot of how we think about where the plenty actually exists and who we have to get it from, and not thinking of each other or oppressed people around the world as our competition, but thinking of them as our allies and finding the ways to actually build that solidarity. But that's a lot of work, and it does take some rewiring around how we think about our ask and how we think about our demands.
One of the things that hit me about your presentation, Rashad, the point about winning, my experience in the 60s is that it was the fact that first the civil rights movement and then some of the other movements that were powered by the civil rights movement actually won some things that got those people who were disillusioned and cynical about politics involved. That was the big upsurge of so many people who didn't believe change was possible. And then, a change is going to come. People get ready, keep on pushing. It inspired people. And I'm curious if you or Color of Change has a particular idea about what will be some of the first changes that we might be able to get in the new political landscape. And there's a lot of progressive legislation up there: Medicare for All, Green New Deal, PRO Act, Breathe Act, the stimulus, COVID relief. Do you have a differentiation there of which things might come first, a first 100-day kind of idea of what might be the quickest wins, shall we say?
Yeah. The first thing I'll just say just about, the 60s, as I as I've been reflecting on them with the loss of John Lewis and C.T. Vivian and others, was such a huge moment for written rule change, policy change, change that infrastructure had to be built on the right to dismantle, but it took decades, and so much of it is still in place, right? Those policies that were won and fought for. I don't know if we're in this, I don't believe, actually, to be really clear, that we're in the same type of sweeping rule change moment. I believe we're in more of a cultural change rule moment. And cultural change oftentimes comes before policy change. But culture change is a lot harder to defend, right? Because culture change, you can't write it into a law that then is protected by infrastructure. You have to constantly feed it, constantly grow it, constantly fight for it. Just like the powering of people to be engaged after George Floyd and Breonna Taylor is just as connected to that Amy Cooper video in Central Park and people seeing the strategy that they oftentimes don't get to see. In terms of actual legislation, I think that, all the things that you named are going to be incredibly important. I do think that there's going to be questions about what's actually achievable. I think from an actual power perspective, we should be thinking about power as organizers and thinking about the long term. And that's why I think voting rights and democracy reform are going to be absolutely key to being able to ensure that the levers of power actually exist for us to not only win more, but hold on to the victories. And I don't think that we can sort of put that aside. I just think it's going to be so incredibly important. If you think about 2008 to 2010 period after President Obama was elected, and we did have that sort of levers of power, but all across the country in states, Tea Party legislators introduced voter ID laws. They introduced all of these pieces of legislation that set us back in so many ways. The American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, and others sort of powered sort of new infrastructure to make it harder for people to participate. So I believe that political participation is important. And then I believe that has to coincide with actually delivering for people. So, first and foremost, I do think that we've got to deal with what's in front of us, which is COVID relief and COVID relief at scale and resources. And so when I think about the three types of power, going back to that, the power to win big, the power to actually take care of our people and make sure our people are whole, right? People are in pain and people are dying and people do not have the things they need. And as organizers and activists, we actually have to deal with that so that we can have people in a place for those long-term victories, and we can help them dream about them and believe that they're actually possible.
Yeah, Rashad, I'm actually really happy that you brought up the COVID-19 pandemic and just what the terrain of struggle and what we can win in the first 100 days looks like. In the housing sector, we've been talking about not going back to a normal. Like we're facing an unprecedented eviction crisis right now. We have tens of millions of people who are living in fear of being evicted from their homes. And that's obviously due to the pandemic, but even before the pandemic, evictions were skyrocketing. And we have this saying that we want to move beyond recovery. Yes. We don't want to just recover from the COVID-19 crisis, the economic downturn. We want to move into something better, something more for our people. And I like what you said in the beginning, in a piece of your presentation. You said there are no good old days for Black and brown people. It's just the road ahead. And so I think about the Biden-Harris administration. And one of the worries that I have is that, we're going to have massive amounts of people and also in our movements, this relief, right? That Trump is no longer going to be president and that all we need to do is just recover from the last 4 years. And I think that, that is going to lead us to a very unstrategic place. And so when it comes to just advancing democracy and using racial justice as the driver and the vehicle, we're also going to have to, I believe, push back against Biden and this bourgeoisie democracy that we have, and fight for a real multiracial democracy. And so I just kind of want to get your thoughts on what it would look like to hold a Biden-Harris administration accountable, what it would look like to push forward a racial justice strategy against an administration that is going to benefit from coming off of the heels of the Trump presidency.
That's such a great question again. And, I also think it becomes very hard to believe we've won if racial justice is your strategy, right? If racial justice is your strategy, then recovery isn't actually winning. And that, once again, is that if you make that sort of a centerpiece of how you think about it, then you hold, corporations accountable in the right way. You hold government accountable in the right way because you're holding them not to some sort of standard of less pain, but you're holding them to a standard of more justice. And I think that just has to be how we think about it. That's, once again, right, the reason why I center racial justice and believe racial justice is our most powerful force multiplier for change is because I want to win. And winning actually isn't about an election. Winning is about real world change that makes people's lives better. And in order to actually do that, we have to fundamentally undo all of these norms and practices that have been put us in harm's way. And that is why this is so important. Otherwise, you actually do get to a place where government sort of working, people who are talking heads on media feel like things are back to being normal. Our phones aren't going off every moment with the latest Trump tweet. It doesn't mean, right, that there's not still children being ripped away from their parents at the border. It still doesn't mean that we don't have 4% of the world's population and 25% of the world's incarcerated population. It doesn't mean all of those things. And so that is why we actually can't be in a phase where restoration is our metric of success, but racial justice is. And I know I keep going back to it as a thing, but that's why I center it, because it allows us to look at all these disparate pieces and say, hey, actually, if we can see ourselves inside of it, and in a country, right, where Black people are not the majority, but this summer, racial justice became a majoritarian issue, we have to seize that, and we have to use that to win.
I see a question from the chat from Mario. There it is. Do you think we can make the changes needed within the party system? I assume means the party system we have now, or do we need to find a way around them? So that's a question for Rashad, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, look, I cut my early career working on alternative voting systems. I have two books that I had to put here so I could sit up my computer up so that I could get the right angle. And one is John Lewis's Walking with the Wind, and the other is Lift Every Voice by Lanny Grenier. And if you have not read Lift Every Voice by Lanny Grenier, of course, John Lewis's book is incredible too, but Lift Every Voice by Lanny Grenier really does dig into sort of representation. Right. And so I guess I want to speak to the sort of racial justice dynamics, not just more parties and what does that mean inside of a system that more parties may not actually mean anything more. And once again, I'm going to go back to racial justice, right? I don't think that more parties produces racial justice. I think racial justice and building power inside of this democracy will help us power us to the systems that we need and give us the energy to actually design the new systems, but and help us lay bare the inequities, the problems with our current system. So will multiple parties be better? Possibly, but you can't just overlay a new structure on a system that is designed to exploit, harm, target, and then hope for better outcomes without actually dealing with the sort of incentive structures that are at the heart of how our economy works and how our democracy works.
Thanks, Rashad. I wanted to maybe take us in a slightly different direction. I love that you think as an infrastructure builder, and this sort of both the framework around racial justice, but also the roles and how people can get in the game on the fight for racial justice. And if we know one thing, this summer is the largest social movement in US history. There are plenty of people that are trying to, for the first time possibly, join these fights. And I guess I had a question for you, which is like, what do you think are the qualities that are necessary to really win the kind of power that you're talking about? Like, what's the muscles we need to stay the course, to continually bring us back to racial justice as a central organizing principle? But more importantly, I think even within the conversation of racial justice, to center anti-Blackness.
Yeah, well, absolutely, the centering of anti-Blackness. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this as I've been like trying to like lead an organization, be a good movement partner, and write a book about. And so sometimes I like start off with like what we don't want to get myself to what we do want. And I've also been thinking a lot about, you know, in my apartment, you can't see it here, but and that back there is a picture of Bayard Rustin. But I've got like a lot of these prints from Ebony and Jet magazine. And for folks that don't know Ebony and Jet would come into the homes once a week, and Ebony comes once a month. Johnson Publications in Chicago. And the thing about Ebony and Jet was that it was like unapologetically celebration of Blackness, right? Both a mix of Black struggle, but Black joy. Black joy is not the absence of pain, but the presence of aspiration, not just what we are fighting against, but what we are fighting for. And it would be this celebration, right, of like, what does it mean to just see ourselves inside of these publications, beautiful, happy, struggling. But one thing about Ebony and Jet that struck me growing up was all the ways in which we celebrated Black achievement through those publications. The new Black CEO at a corporation, the new Black police chief, the new Black whatever. And it was a theory of change, a strategy that if we could get inside of these systems, that these systems would sort of operationalize themselves and benefit us. And it got so far, right? Up into it. And so I don't want to, it's not a critique of it. It absolutely makes sense. And in some ways it was inspiring for me growing up on Eastern Long Island, not having any Black teachers, being the first in my family to eventually go to college, to see these faces, to see, you know, as Laverne Cox says, possibility models for yourself, right? And so I think it's incredibly important, right? At the same time, the limitations of what does it mean to just get ourselves inside of systems that are not designed for us. And so when I think about what is required, right, in these days, it is that translating of presence and visibility to power, not accepting presence and visibility, shout outs from the stage. It doesn't mean that those things are not bad, right? I'm not critiquing those publications, which are so powerful. I'm saying that if we don't translate presence to power, we can think that we've done something that we haven't actually done. We can think that a Black president means that we are post-racial. We can think that America's celebration of Black celebrities means that we can mistake it and think that America loves Black people as much as America loves Black culture. And America can love, celebrate, and monetize Black culture and hate Black people at the same time. And those two things don't actually have to be in conflict. And so I think just in terms of what does it mean moving forward, really being clear about sort of what the North Star is of what we're fighting for. And that has to be rule change, both written rule change and unwritten rule change, because only if we are fully changing the rules are we actually building the type of society, the type of structures that allow all of us to participate. It is not about Black faces in high places. It is about making sure we change those structures. And put another way, a good friend, Dorian Warren, who runs Community Change, said this line to me, so I'm gonna make sure I quote him. He says, "We do not want a rainbow oligarchy." And I think, like, just in terms of what we're trying to achieve, not fighting for a rainbow oligarchy, which is like just diversity and inclusion without rule change, it is about changing structures.
Thanks, Rashad. Black joy, rule change, power. Those are great notes to end this program on. And it's just the beginning of a discussion, but it's what we could do tonight. We really appreciate you taking the time. Thanks, everybody, for watching. OrgUp Presents will be back again with more discussions like this. Give Organizing Upgrade a like on Facebook, like or subscribe on YouTube. Thanks, Rashad Robinson, President of Color of Change. See you all in the next discussion. Thanks so much.
Appreciate you.